Leif Hans Larsen Tronstad, later awarded the DSO and OBE, was a Norwegian scientist, intelligence officer, military organizer, and gifted leader. A note on this map: Rjukan, Stavanger, and Egersund. Tronstad's plan was overruled by combined operations in the British War Office in London, who controlled the British Army commandos. They opted for a glider-borne mission codenamed Freshman. This only required 4 of Tronstadt's Norwegian commandos to carry out the Pathfinder part of the operation, which was called Operation Grouse. 75 years ago, on November the 19th, 1942, at 1750 hours, a Royal Air Force 4-engine Halifax bomber from 38 Group Royal Air Force lumbered down the runway of Skitton Airfield in the north of Scotland, towing a Mark I Horsa glider loaded with young British airborne Royal Engineers heading for Telemark in Norway. 10 minutes later, another combination followed. Operation Freshman, the first attempt to prevent Nazi Germany developing the atomic bomb, had been launched. Waiting for them in Norway were Tronstadt's Norwegian commandos, the Grouse Group. All had grown up in the Telemark area of Norway, which included Rjukan and Vemork. The after-raid escape plan was sketchy at best. The raiders were to ditch their British uniforms, disguise themselves as Norwegians, and escape 250 miles across the snow-covered mountains to Sweden. They were taught a few simple Norwegian phrases and ordered to shave any moustaches and grow their hair long to blend in with the Norwegians. This is not difficult for British Army officers who grow their hair long anyway, as you'll see in a later climbing video. With the British sappers' inability to ski, Tronstad and the Norwegians remaining behind in the UK thought that Freshman was a suicide mission. In the worsening weather, the young airborne sappers were bumped around in their gliders in the air. Although it was dark, they could see each other's faces, and they were trying hard not to show fear. Many yawned, others felt airsick, longing for the moment they would leave the glider for the fresh Norwegian mountain air. They did not know that far worse was yet to come. They had not heard of the Kommandobefehl, Hitler's commando order, issued on October the 18th, 1942, just 1 month before they took off. He had directed that all Allied commandos encountered by German forces in combat should be killed immediately without trial, even if they were in uniform. The Rebecca receiver in the first Halifax towplane was unable to pick up the signal sent out by Haugland's Eureka beacon. As a result, the Royal Air Force crew had to try finding the landing area at night, navigating only by map, an impossible task in the ever-deteriorating Norwegian weather. On the ground, Haugland, the radio operator, picked up the towplane's Rebecca signal in his Eureka beacon, and he heard the drone of an aircraft in the sky. He shouted to Paulson, who, with the other men, illuminated the landing site. On the second attempt to find the landing area, ice had formed on the Halifax, its bucking glider, and the tow rope. The tow rope snapped, freeing the glider, which crash-landed in the dark some 20 miles from Stavanger, killing 3 of the 17 men on board. Local Norwegians sheltered and gave medical attention to the injured sappers. Before the Germans arrived 24 hours later, all the documents and maps from the crash had been burned. The German troops, which included Waffen-SS, took the survivors prisoner. The second combination fared even worse. They managed to reach the coast of Norway, but due to severe weather, the second Halifax released its glider at considerable altitude in high winds. In rain and hail, the second Halifax crashed into a Norwegian mountain near the coast, and all on board died instantly. On discovery of the wreck, the Germans threw the bodies of the crew into a nearby bog. The second freed glider spiraled out of control, crashing into the mountains, 43 miles from Stavanger and 150 miles from the landing site. 7 men were killed instantly and many more seriously injured. The survivors, unwilling to leave the wounded, sought help while burning all sensitive documents. Eventually, the Germans arrived. They took them to a camp near Egersund, and later all were taken to a nearby wood and shot. Their bodies were thrown into an unmarked grave. Local Norwegian civilians tended the grave until the end of the war. The Gestapo tortured the injured survivors from the first glider. They killed 3 of the injured men by injecting air into their bloodstream. The 4th was shot in the back of the head and their bodies dumped into the sea. The remaining 5 uninjured sappers were held at Greenie concentration camp west of Oslo until January the 18th, 1943, when they too were taken into nearby woods and shot. I laid flowers on their memorial during the reenactment of the raid for television in March 1983. The British thought they had burned all the maps, but one in the second glider was overlooked. When the Germans found it, they were able to identify Wehrmacht as the target. The Grouse Group, having heard a tow plane and glider combination for a second time with no response, realized something had gone disastrously wrong. On instructions from Tronstad in London, they slipped away into the heart of the Hardangervidda to try to survive and continue to send intelligence back to Tronstad in London. For security reasons, their group was renamed Swallow. Operation Freshman, the first Allied attempt to prevent the Nazis developing an atomic weapon, had been a total failure. The questions facing both President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill were not just how to build an atomic bomb themselves, but how to stop Germany doing the same. The answer was to halt the supply of heavy water from Wehrmacht. The failure of the Freshman operation put the Allies in a very difficult position. An idea to bomb Wehrmacht by night by the Royal Air Force had been discounted due to the inaccuracies of bombing, the likelihood of high civilian casualties, and uncertainty that even if the hydrogen building was hit, the heavy water plant deep inside might not be damaged. Nevertheless, General Leslie Groves, the abrasive, egotistical chief of Manhattan, was arguing strongly for a massive bomber raid by the US 8th Air Force. Tronstad and SOE argued against bombing, promoting instead Tronstad's original plan using Norwegian commandos. The Grouse Swallow team was already on the Hardangervidda. Combined operations in the War Department sided with Tronstad and the SOE. The next phase was known as Operation Gunnercide. Christian Christiansen turned out to be a local hunter who knew the countryside well. He agreed to lead them to the rendezvous with the Grouse Swallow team. The Gunnercide group, led by Christiansen, headed out carrying heavy rucksacks and dragging poles. By the way, in this video from the 40th reenactment, I am the skier with the dark belt end hanging down in front of me. After a day of skiing across the Hardangervidda, they spotted 2 skiers. They hid, fearing them to be German Gebirgsjäger or ski troops. But on closer inspection, Haukelid, I know it's a little confusing with all this Haukelid and Haukelins and Hellbergs, but Haukelid managed to spot Haukeland. The Gunnercide and Swallow teams had met. They were ecstatic. They released Christiansen with the promise he was to keep the news of what he had seen to himself. The newly enlarged Gunnercide team now discussed how they were going to attack the plant at Wehrmacht. Tronstad had advised them to climb down into the gorge, cross the river on the ice floes, and scale the cliffs on the other side. But Roderick favored the original Freshman plan of fighting their way across the bridge, doing the job, as he called it when I met him in 1983, and then fighting their way out. Hellberg, the local mountain guide, thought otherwise. He asked Ronneberg if he could ski down into the gorge and see if a covert approach was possible. Ronneberg agreed and let him go. On his return, Hellberg assured the team he had found a way down into the gorge, a place to cross the river, and a way up the cliff on the other side that did not require ropes. Ronneberg taught to each one individually and then allowed them to vote. They decided on the covert climbing assault. Even with the idea of a covert entry, the raiders believed that once the charges exploded, their chances of escape were minimal. This was going to be a one-way operation. Tronstad came up with a plan to prevent the Nazis from destroying Norwegian infrastructure before the end of the war. This plan became known as Operation Sunshine. Since the war seemed to be nearing its end, SOE acceded to Tronstadt's request that he command this mission on the ground rather than from London. On October the 4th, 1944, he was parachuted into Norway with his old friend and mountain guide, Helberg. Einar Skinneland was on the ground to set up the landing lights and meet him. On March the 11th, 1945, a Norwegian Quisling shot and killed Tronstad. The greatest Norwegian hero of World War II died at the hands of another Norwegian before he could be reunited with his family. At the end of the war, the Norwegian raiders became national heroes. Their stories told multiple times in films, TV docudramas, and books. It never went to their heads. They remained humble to the end. I will leave you with this. On the 40th anniversary of the raid, when we were meeting the raiders and taking part in the reenactment for television, the United States government surprised Knut Haukelid, who had been born in the US, by presenting him with an American passport. Thank you.